Welcome to this podcast sponsored by the Boisi Center for Religion and American Public Life at Boston College. My name is Mark Massa, and I have the happy duty of being the director of the center. And today we have an especially promising and interesting conversation with Owen Fletcher, who's currently a junior at Boston College with a major in international studies and a minor in religion and American public life, who did a very interesting project last year, and he just gave a formal presentation at one of our lunch conversations here at the center. So welcome, Owen.
Thank you for having me.
So Owen, say a few words about what project you did, and explain the center that you undertook it at, and what three questions. Okay, I'll be more direct. What was your project? Tell us about the Center for Christian Jewish Learning, and how, if at all, did your project change in the course of doing it?
Perfect. So as you said, I was doing a project with the Center for Christian Jewish Learning on campus, and I'd like to thank the Reverend Dr. Jocelyn Semiakowski and Dr. Markey, both of whom helped me greatly with this project. And so the project began with a look into Christian and Jewish rhetoric in terms of migration. And being Catholic myself, I really wanted to look at how Catholic thought has changed and also kind of now exists with this ethic of migration. Professor Heyer in the Theology department helped me articulate these ideas as well. And I also wanted to look at how, especially, this might be an opportunity for interreligious dialogue. So how both Christian and Jewish thought might allow it to be the case that we could have a dialogue of interaction or a dialogue of action between these two faith traditions. So I began the project like that, with looking at these broader ideas of theology and of migration. And I moved from these theological ideas into maybe ideas looking at how this impacted sociologically people and their actions with migration work. So moving from just abstract ideas that we can look at in the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament of migration, and moving that into an ethic that leads people into migration work in the Boston area, specifically with Catholic Charities and Jewish Family Service of Metro West, but also other groups like Jewish Vocational Services in downtown Boston, or the Paulus Center also in downtown Boston. So many different faith-based or faith-oriented groups in the Boston area.
So what was the working title of the project when you began, and how, if at all, did the project evolve, either in directions you thought it would or in surprising directions?
Certainly. So the title of the project was Welcoming the Stranger, because that is something that when you think about migration, or you think about migration work through these kind of theological lenses, that texts from the Old Testament kind of pops out at you, and it makes sure that you have this thought, or at least that I had this thought of welcoming the stranger as something central to Jewish and Christian texts and Jewish and Christian action. But it changed from simply migration work in Boston to kind of why it is that people engage themselves in this work. So it's not simply that this work exists, because it does, and that would be maybe a different project to look at the structures that are in place. But I looked at how an idea of faith came out of this, and how people acted through their religious traditions to express some idea of faith coming out of this. So it moved maybe from simply migration work in the Boston area to an ethic or a faith-based orientation of this work.
So did you find that the Jewish and Catholic groups proceeded pretty much from the same values, or was there differences between the way Jewish believers approached the question of dealing with immigrants and the stranger, and how Catholics dealt with the same question?
So they definitely had differences between them. And maybe they did start from the same center or from the same base, but the differences were quite interesting. I remember one person who I interviewed, and I don't remember their name off the top of my head, but said that the idea of uh, Judaism in America being inherently a religion made up of migrants, and with this idea of diaspora in the Jewish tradition, is something that was very important for them, and that they expressed to me quite dearly. And in the Catholic tradition, although it is something very similar, made up of primarily immigrant populations, there is a difference in the way that these two kind of religious groups talked about it, or at least believers um, expressed the way that they interacted with their own religion.
Could you elucidate what those differences were? Like, give me a couple examples of how the Jewish approach to these questions differs somewhat from the Catholic approach.
Certainly. And so they were both rooted in an idea of faith and of acting through religion. But it seemed that, at least from my understanding, the way that my Jewish colleagues and the people that I interviewed spoke about it uh, seemed very rooted in a an ethic that I hadn't encountered, or that I hadn't encountered previously. That being an ethic surrounded on uh, maybe not do's and don'ts, but surrounded on an ethic of love that I hadn't previously encountered in uh, this in my exploration of Jewish ethics. Whereas in the Catholic tradition, I of course encountered this ethic of love, but it was displayed in different ways. So the ways, perhaps to elucidate this point better, the ways and the degrees to which people were able to express why they did this. So in the Catholic tradition, it would be more of a corporal work of mercy to help the stranger.
Okay, explain for our listeners, for those who are not as well versed in Catholic theology as you are, Owen, explain what the corporal works of mercy are.
Yeah, perfectly. And now that I obviously, maybe not obviously, but I'm unable to list them off the top of my head. But what comes up most prominently, and these are all stemming from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, but the idea that uh, one encounters Jesus, one encounters the Christ in those around them. The corporal works of mercy, which are sheltering the naked, or sheltering the homeless, or clothing the naked, feeding the hungry. But we see these ideas being able to allow somebody to express the reasons that they engage themselves in migration work. So it is not simply that people do this because it is a good thing, but it helps them express the idea that they encounter Christ in the people that they help. And of course,
So
this has caveats to it.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Say again.
But this has caveats to it, and it's not the case that every person expresses the idea that they encounter Christ in these people. But it helps to understand why people might engage themselves in this work and how it might move into different areas.
So, of course, Jesus is described very often in the New Testament, in the Gospels, as a Hebrew prophet, and he was very familiar with the Jewish prophetic tradition in Jewish scripture. So would you say that the Catholic Christian take on this, which are, as you say, the corporal works of mercy, which is feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, welcoming the stranger, visiting those in prison, that do those arise directly out of Jewish scripture into the Catholic tradition, or is there any difference in the translation from Jewish to Christian?
Maybe there's not difference in translation, but it certainly is a linear path. And that is the thing that interests me a lot in this research, because it is linear, but it's not simply one to one. It is not that we see the exact same language or the exact same commandments or teachings in these two traditions, but it becomes a path where dialogue is easy because the two exist almost in conversation from the very beginning. So it's not that we have to force these two into action and into conversation. But from the very beginning, we have, as you say, Jesus as a Hebrew prophet, using Hebrew rhetoric and using the rhetoric of the Hebrew Bible to express his very ideas. And so it is a conversation inherently in the very nature of these ideas.
So when you were setting up the project over at the center here at BC, part of it was actually interviewing sort of live immigrants, and people who, in fact, are victims of flight from their native countries, and they were seeking shelter, documents, all kinds of things. What did you find? What was the biggest surprise when you actually encountered these people being served by Jewish and Catholic groups? And what was the biggest non-surprise in terms of people who come to Boston and desperately in need of services?
Perfect. So, and although that my project wasn't necessarily centered on these people, the conversations that I did have were very important because they kind of both confirmed things that I found in my research, and as you said, they surprised me. And so, maybe to start off with the biggest surprise is the idea that these people or the latest wave of immigrants into Boston are not necessarily Catholic or Christian or Jewish, but they are primarily Muslim or from Islamic countries. So we can think of Syrian refugees, which have been for the past couple of years, maybe the biggest group. And taking this, it is again inherent nature of the very waves of migration that are in Boston right now, that there has to be some sort or some level of interreligious interaction. And so that surprised me the most because I thought that perhaps it would just be the case that people would help those like them. So it would only be Catholic groups helping new Catholic immigrants or Jewish groups helping Jewish immigrants, which is not the case at all, which is kind of it is good to know. And it is something that is, I would view as a positive thing. And then something that wasn't surprising is the fact that these people that are coming, so speaking specifically on Syrian refugees, a lot of them, this is their home. So it's not the case that they are seeking to return, which creates a different reality and a different way of working with these people. Because we cannot simply say, okay, I'm preparing you to go back to your home. But instead, these groups and as both refugees and the people helping them expressed, it is the case of welcoming them into America and kind of preparing them for the stressors and for the realities of America and of the United States, and especially of Boston and of the Northeast, which might be different than if you were in the western part of the country or even on our southern border.
Was there, in terms of your sort of like following these folks and talking to them, was there an initial distrust or unease since they come from religious tradition? It's different than the Jewish Catholic organizations that were set up to serve them. Was there distrust or was there uncertainty about what they found, or what was their reaction to what they found in Boston?
I don't necessarily think that there would be distrust. It seems more like religion isn't the first thing that they encounter. The first thing that they encounter are people willing to help and people seeking to help them, rather than a Christian or a Jewish person coming and saying, "Hey, I am Christian, therefore I am helping you." It seems that they are instead people willing to help, and Americans at that, willing to help these people who are new to the country. So starting with this idea of them being Americans and them being willing to help, it leads to different conversations. So the premise is not based on religion, but it's based on something different, which is something that I found very interesting.
So in both cases, in the cases of both Jewish Family Services and the Catholic group, religion itself was not foregrounded. It was not the thing that was up front. It was actually, it sounds as you're describing it, Owen, is that it was the energizer. It was the reason for them doing that, but it wasn't really. They didn't see this as a Catholic task or a Jewish task. Would that be correct?
But perhaps they did see this as a Catholic task or as a Jewish task, but it wasn't necessarily an idea of prophesizing those people that they worked with. It wasn't that they were seeking to convert those that they helped, but rather doing this because it was a Catholic task or a Jewish task. And they did this because they were Catholic or Jewish, but not necessarily because those that they helped were, which is something that is interesting because it brings this idea of religion and of faith as the driving force rather than another person's religion or another person's faith as the driving force.
Interesting. So, what was your biggest what was the biggest surprise from beginning the project to ending the project? What did you discover that you were not prepared to discover, and what wasn't a big surprise?
So when I set up the project, and this is something that I'm still figuring out in my own research, but I wanted to explore this idea of faith. And I've said faith a number of times in this very conversation, but the idea of faith as driving this work or as propelling someone to do something. And the biggest thing that surprised me is that's not maybe the first thing that someone will say. It's not in the conversation that I had that someone will straight off the bat say, I do this because of my faith, or I do this because I am Christian or Jewish, which interestingly, I wanted to be the case. I wanted, as my hypothesis, I wanted something easy that someone would just say, oh, I do this because of my faith, and next question. So it surprised me that although faith was still a central idea and people were still talking about it, the nature of the conversations was not a definition of faith that you could look up in a dictionary. It wasn't that faith was X, Y, or Z, and because of X, Y, or Z, I do the things that I do. But this notion of faith really surprised me in the way that people spoke about it, but still that it existed. And I think that to that very point, something that didn't surprise me was the fact that when people were discussing, they were able to use religion as a language that helped them to express the things that the work that they were doing, especially in regards to migrants and refugees. So it provided a language that I, having done my research and them having kind of lived out the work that they are doing, was a common language for the two of us. And that, not surprisingly, people were actually able to articulate these things using religious truths.
And the fact that you weren't expecting that but encountered that, did that change the focus of your project at all?
I think it certainly did, because I really, again, I wanted this hypothesis of faith to work out, but it became more of an interpersonal discussion. So a lot of the research that I did was primarily through interviews, and so having people to speak with and having different ideas come out in each and every interview was something that inherently changed the very nature of the project, because it wasn't simply that I could read a book and then see these direct overlaps, but that I had to take what I could read in ethical and theological ideas and transpose them onto the very real situations that we see in our community.
And so it sounds like you discovered what every professor does when he or she does research. That is, it's one thing to propose your topic and propose your thesis. It's quite another thing to actually explore the material. And oftentimes what you find is that the way you pose the question is partially correct and partially incorrect. So you have to rethink through what it is you're asking and what it is you think you're going to find out there. So it sounds like that was your experience as well.
Definitely. And I think that with this internship with the Center for Christian Jewish Learning, that was kind of the goal. The very goal was to learn how to do research and to learn that what I first proposed was not going to be my final product, and that I couldn't know a priori all of these ideas and all of these uh, kind of thoughts that would come out of the research that I would do and the conversations that I would have. So, and constantly speaking with you as my advisor, with the idea that we would have to reconstruct the project as we went through it. And so it wasn't the case that I could just stick to the plan, but that the plan had to be constantly changed and constantly revamped with the new information that I had.
So during your lunch conversation here at Boisi, at which Professor Jocelyn Zmatowski was present as well, you brought in two very powerful, I think, individuals, somebody from Jewish Family Services and someone from the Paulist Center in downtown Boston and their outreach efforts. And it seems to me that I couldn't tell, and so I want to ask you, is there any kind of conversation between those two groups? Is there any kind of coordination or cooperation, or is what they do pretty much sort of watertight, done in watertight compartments that are parallel but not really cooperative?
So they're not necessarily watertight, but at the same time, there is not direct overlap or cooperation between the two groups. They do very uh, parallel kind of strands of work, but because of the work that they do and because of how wide reaching it is, and because in the Boston area, these groups are constantly working together, maybe not directly with a cooperation or a joint effort, but they are constantly drawing from each other and in conversation with each other. So there are many interfaith coalitions in Boston, kind of dealing with migrants, refugees. But it isn't that this work is entirely an interfaith effort. It is just by its very nature, it has to be.
Interesting. So do you think did you discover in your own research talking to these people who take care of migrants and refugees, is there an opportunity toward greater interfaith sharing on these sort of things? I mean, it's interesting. It was interesting to me listening to you and the two individuals who asked to come to lunch. It seems that they have figured out how to deal with the appropriate population, and I'm just wondering how there's not overlap, how both groups serve the same family, or perhaps both groups do serve the same families. Does that ever happen?
Not necessarily, just because the work that is being done is very to the individual. So individual families or individual groups will take care of migrant refugee families on a kind of a one-to-one basis. So the overlap that does happen is in the structures that are in place. So the National Refugee Resettlement Program from the United States kind of has affiliations on the local level. And so it isn't maybe the way that the dialogue can be expanded here is drawing from what works and what doesn't work for other groups. And I think that even in the conversations that I had, this kind of appeared. And people said, well, I first got started in this work because I talked to another group, and what they were doing, they kind of taught me what didn't or what did work, and they went from there. So although it's individualized and people have to understand what works for them and what works for the people that they are helping, it is at the same time a wider effort, and they have to learn from other groups, even when they're beginning and in conversation accordingly.
You began our conversation this morning by thanking Dr. Markey and Dr. Jocelyn Zmatowski, who run the Center for Christian Jewish Learning. I want you to put a plug. I'll be quite overt about this, okay? I want you to put a plug in for other students undertaking projects through that center. I think you're the third of the minors in religion and American public life who benefited greatly from the generosity and the support of the center Why would you encourage other students at Boston College to undertake similar projects, not necessarily on migrants and refugees, but other projects through the center? And what's the opportunity there?
Well, and I'd actually like to say the fact that other students maybe even shouldn't do the same project that I did is actually a benefit to this very open project that or this open internship that the Center for Christian Jewish Learning allowed me, because it allowed me to explore things that I really wanted to explore, and it allowed me to propose my own project and do my own research on a topic that I was very interested in, but that I otherwise wouldn't have looked at through this lens of Christian and Jewish relations. And so for other students with anything that really might fit this topic of Christian and Jewish dialogue or interaction or relations, it allows them, and I'd encourage them, to seek out ways in which they might be able to take their own interests and turn it into a project, with a lot of support both from the advisor that they would choose, but also from those at the Center for Christian Jewish Learning, making sure that the project kind of goes to plan, and also, as we talked about, that this plan can and will change. So it's a project that allows undergraduates and also graduate students to create their own plan and to create their own project in their own interests, and something that, as we've talked about, will end up becoming a wider and broader topic than you might imagine.
And so when you were actually exploring the research and fulfilling your project, I presume you went back to Dr. Markey and or Dr. Jocelyn Simitowski with ideas, and did they help you hone and direct and perhaps nuance your original project into the project that actually happened, the project that you actually ended up doing?
Definitely, especially with Dr. Justin Semiakowski, he helped me to kind of take the ideas that I had been having and the research that I had been doing and look into it in a different lens. And so the conversations that I had in that, and maybe this happened every month or 2 months in my project, I would take what I had been learning and have a conversation much like the one that we're having now, where we bounced ideas off of one another and we saw where and in what direction the project might go next. So it was very helpful to have that support, and to know that I had that support, but also to not be afraid to reach out with an email or to stop by his office hours when I thought that maybe I needed a nudge in the right direction.
Is this research and the kind of work that you accomplished in your project? Is this something you want to continue in the future? I mean, do you see yourself engaged in similar or analogous kinds of projects moving forward, both as, in the senior year of Boston College and perhaps beyond that?
Certainly. And so being very interested in migration, and having done this project and allowing myself to have different directions and different areas in which to explore, I think that maybe it'll turn into a senior thesis project, or it'll propel me in my career being interested in migration and migration studies. And although it was rooted in the Jewish and Christian faith traditions, I think that it also allowed me to explore how these systems are at place in the wider American context and international context. So it's something that I certainly expect, and I hope that I'll be able to continue.
Yeah, and I wish you good luck. I know that both Dr. Markey and Dr. Jocelyn Smitowski were very, very impressed and pleased with the work you did. So congratulations to you. You were doing this. You were doing lots of interviews and work on top of having a day job, as we say, having lots of stuff to do in your regular coursework. So thank you for doing that. Is there anything you would want to add in our conversation? There's something I did not ask you that you would like to be asked.
I can't think of it right now, but I think that the conversation that we had was actually quite fruitful. And I'd just like to thank you again for being my advisor, and thank both Dr. Markey and Dr. Jocelyn Semikowski at the Center for Christian Jewish Learning for their support in this project and for allowing me to be part of the learning that is happening at the center.
Thank you, Owen Fletcher, one of Boston College stars, and thanks for the Center for Christian Jewish Learning again, and good luck in the future, continuing the good work you started here.
Perfect. Thank you very much.